Tritone substitutions are used all the time in jazz. It's a really common device, and so it's something that you really need to get your head around and understand how it works and why it works and how to use them. Like most things, it's pretty simple once you get your head around it, but at first it can be a bit confusing. So I thought I'd take the time to make this video to try and help you out with that. By the end of this video, you'll know what a tritone substitution is, you'll know why it works, and you'll know how to use it and put it into context of musical situation. So I hope you find this video useful, and if you do, then please give it a thumbs up and maybe leave a nice comment. That would really help me out. Also, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can get all my videos as I upload them. Okay, so let's get into it. So what is a tritone substitution? Well, a substitution is when we replace one chord with another chord that does the same job. And just like when you get a substitute at work or on a gig, the substitute obviously has to be qualified to do the job. So there's certain things that the substitute chord needs to have to be able to function as a replacement for the original chord. You can't just put any chord in there. There's certain requirements. And the tritone part refers to the interval of a tritone. So an interval is the space between two notes. And the interval of a tritone means, tri means 3, and we know that a tone is 2 semitones. So a tritone interval is 3 tones, 3 whole tones. So for instance, if we were to start on a G and were to move up 3 whole tones, 3 tones, 1, 2, 3, what we get is the interval of 3 tones. So this is our tritone interval, okay? And of course you can go down or up. So if we start on a D, and if we were to go down a tritone, what would the note be that we get? It's an A flat or G sharp, whichever you want to call it, because that's 3 tones down. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Another way of thinking of this is counting. If you want to count the semitones, you can count 6 semitones. So let's do one more. Let's start on F. If we go up 6 semitones, which is the same as 3 tones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we get the B, which is the same as 3 tones up. 1, 2, 3. Let's do one more now. So I'll start. If we start on a B flat and we go up a tritone, what would the note be? Yes, it's an E. Well done. So we go up a tone, up another tone, and up another tone. So the tritone is an interval of 3 tones. Now there's something very significant and special about a tritone interval, and it's different from all the other intervals for one reason, and that is that when you invert a tritone, you get the same interval, okay? Because a tritone is exactly half an octave. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we start on an A and we go up a tritone, we get to our E flat, D sharp. And then if we take that interval and we invert it, and what I mean by that is we take the bottom note and put it on the top. So we get the A up here, E flat and the A. What we get is also a tritone. This is a tritone, 1, 2, 3 tones, okay? So remember, a tritone is 6 semitones, and an octave is 12 semitones. So the tritone is exactly halfway. So whichever way round you play, whichever inversion you use, it's still a tritone, and that's not true of other intervals. So for instance, if we look in C, if we play a major third, when we invert that interval, we'll put this C up the top, what we get is a minor 6th, okay? And then a minor third, if we invert that, what we get is a major 6th. Perfect 5th, when we invert it, becomes a perfect 4th. Yeah, and a perfect 4th, when we invert that, becomes a perfect 5th. So every interval has its kind of like a flip side. When it's inverted, it becomes another interval, except the tritone. It's always a tritone. And that's why this tritone substitution works, because what it means is that there's another chord that shares the same interval, the same notes, because when we invert that interval, we get the same notes, okay? And so we'll look at that next. So the first thing you need to know about tritone substitutions is that they only work on dominant seventh chords, because the dominant seventh chord is the only chord that is qualified for this substitution. It contains the right qualities, it contains the tritone that we need to be able to make this substitution. So you can only substitute dominant seventh chords with other dominant seventh chords when you're doing a tritone substitution. Now if we take our chords from our diatonic scale, okay, so we look at if we're looking in C major, okay, chord 1 is major 7, chord 2 is minor 7, chord 3 is minor 7, chord 4 is major 7, chord 5 is dominant 7, chord 6 is minor 7, and chord 7 is minor 7 flat 5 or half diminished, whatever you want to call it. So what we've got are 7 different chords there, but there are only 4 different types of chords, okay, because the major 7 chord comes in twice and the minor 7 chord comes in 3 times, here, here and here. So now if we look at the 4 chord types, okay, and we put them all in the same key now, let's look at them all as one with the same root and have a look what's going on there. So if we look at the major 7 chord starting on G, okay, if we take a G major 7 and we look at the interval between the thirds and the seventh, the third and the seventh, what you get is a perfect fifth interval between the third and the seventh. Okay, we've got major third, major seventh. Let's look at the minor 7 chord now, G minor 7. So we've got a flat third and a flat seventh. And if we look at the interval between those, what we've got is a perfect fifth. And let's look at the minor 7 flat 5 chord now. If we play this chord, okay, we've got a minor third, a flat fifth and a minor seventh, but of course that's not affected the third and seventh. We've still got the perfect fifth. Now let's look at the dominant 7th chord, and this is where things get interesting, because if we look at the dominant 7th chord, we've got a major third and a flattened 7th, and what that creates is a tritone interval between the 3rd and 7th. And this is a very significant feature of dominant 7th chords, okay? That tritone has a very strong character and a very strong flavour to it. It's what gives the dominant 7th chord its character. And what is the character of that? Well, it's one of being very unsettled. So when we hear a tritone, it's a very dissonant interval. It's unsettled, and it means it needs resolving. So it's not happy to stay there. And this is what gives the dominant 7th chord its impetus to want to resolve to the 1 chord. And as we know from a lot of classical music, we hear this a lot, where we can hear chord 5 going to chord 1. And if we invert that, so that's a perfect cadence, a cadence we're very used to hearing. So now let's look at that in context with some actual chords. So if we look at if we stay in the key of C major, and we look at the dominant 7th, that's going to be a G7 chord, okay? And I've written it here in this inversion. So if I'm just going to play the root down here, and I'm going to play the flattened 7th on the bottom and the major 3rd on the top. So I'm not playing the 5th, I'm just working on the 3rds and 7ths here, the most important notes, the functional notes of the chord. There's our dominant 7th chord. Now, as before, we talked about this interval being flipped. So if we flip this, we get the same interval, okay? And what that means is that there's another dominant 7th chord that features those same 2 notes on the 3rds and 7ths, okay? So if we flip that around, so on the G7, this was the 7th and the 3rd. Now if we move the bass down a tritone, what we get is a D flat. And what we can see is that the D flat 7 shares the same notes, but they're inverted, okay? So if we've inverted that tritone, and now what we've got is what was the 7th is now the 3rd, the major 3rd, and what was the 3rd is now the flat 7. Now look at the notation here, because this is where the enharmonic spelling comes into play. In D flat 7, we wouldn't write a B natural, okay, because that note's not in the scale. So what we would write is C flat. Okay, C flat is the flattened seventh in D flat. But as we know, a C flat is the same note, it's the same pitch as B natural. Okay, but it's when we write things down, there's conventions to notation that mean we have to write things differently. So this is why we spell it differently when we write it down. But essentially, it's the same note, it's the same pitch, and that's to do with the conventions of notation. So what we've got now are two chords that share the same notes and the same interval for their thirds and sevenths, okay? And this is why the D flat 7 chord can substitute for the G7 chord, okay? And so now the other thing is, if we look at the bass, the root of the chord, what we can see is that the interval there is also a tritone. So when we look at tritone substitutions, there are actually two parts, two ingredients, of this tritone substitution that involve a tritone, and I think this is something that often confuses people. So we have a tritone interval between the thirds and sevenths, but we also have a tritone root movement. Okay. So what this means is that any dominant seventh chord can be substituted with the dominant seventh chord that is a tritone away from it. Okay, so if we take, let's try another key now. So if we play D7, okay, and I can keep those inner voices, the thirds and sevenths, exactly where they are. All I've got to do is move the bass a tritone, and what I now get is A flat 7. So A flat 7 can substitute for D7 because all I've done is move the bass. These notes, the important notes, the thirds and sevenths, haven't moved. They've just flipped, but they're not affected. And that sound is so strong, it's such a strong flavour and such a feature that our ears hear that as the same thing. Okay, one more, let's try E7. So the tritone substitution for E7 would be B flat 7. So again, E7, we've got the major third and the flat 7, G sharp and D, becomes flat 7, A flat, and major third D. Okay, now let's go back to our G7 chord and its substitution, its tritone substitution, the D flat 7 chord. And let's put that into context of a 2-5-1. And we can see, and now we can see when we do this, why tritone substitutions are so common and so often used by jazz musicians. So a 2-5-1 is one of the most common sequences of chords that you'll come across in jazz, absolutely littered throughout all jazz standards that we play, 2-5-1 sequence. So if we're in the key of C major, what we would get is, I'll just play thirds and sevenths again in the right hand, and I'll play the roots. So if we play D minor 7, chord 2, so we have the flat third here and then flat 7 on top, moves to G7, so the top voice comes down, what we get is a flat 7 major third, and then to C major 7, the middle voice moves down, and we end up with the major third, major 7. Okay, once more. Okay, so that's our classic 2-5-1 progression. Now here's where it gets interesting. Let's substitute the dominant seventh chord in there, the G7, for its tritone substitution, which would be the D flat 7, and let's see what happens here. So now we get this, D minor 7, goes to D flat 7, goes to C major 7. And as you can see now with this substitution, we've got a very smooth chromatic descending bass line, and that is why tritone substitutions are used. Instead of this cyclical moving in fourths, okay, what we get is this. And that gives a very nice smooth voice leading there when we apply the other voices as well. Classic jazz sound there of a 2-5-1 with the tritone substitution. Now, there's one other thing to point out with tritone substitutions. What this now means is, as we've just established from this 2-5-1, is that dominant seventh chords now don't have to resolve down a fifth or up a fourth. Okay, dominant seventh chords, as we established from the D flat 7, can resolve down a semitone. Okay, it's a perfectly acceptable movement. Okay, that cadence, instead of the perfect cadence of 5-1, we've now got this option of playing this lovely cadence where things just move in semitones. So that means that any dominant seventh chord can now resolve down a semitone. So let's look at a few. So let's take F sharp. F sharp 7 can go down to F major 7. Okay, let's try another one. A7 can resolve down to A flat major 7. And that's going to open up a whole load of possibilities of moving in different directions when you're composing and writing. But also this is used a lot by jazz pianists when they're comping. So one of the things that jazz pianists quite often do is they'll add dominant seventh chords in just before another chord. So it just adds a little bit of movement and a little bit of extra harmony. And so what you'll hear them doing is quite often they'll play the dominant seventh, the semitone above. And just that little side step there, it's a nice sound, it's a feature, it's a flavour of jazz that you're kind of used to hearing. They may not have, probably not written even on the chord chart, but when the pianists are comping, they're sort of very often adding these little extra chords in, even though they're not on the chart, and they're what we call passing chords. So they move past, and you know they're just very subtle in the background there. So there you have tritone substitutions. You know, have some fun with that, explore that, and see how many different kind of combinations and options you can come up with. It can really open up a whole new sort of direction of where the harmony goes.